President Obama's great big Syria stall is not going down well in Washington. In just these last hours, we've had comments from two former defense secretaries on either side of the aisle. Here's what they had to say. I'm going to put up a quote first from Leon Panetta, and he said, "When the President of the United States draws a red line, the credibility of this country is dependent on him backing up his word. Once the President came to that conclusion, in other words, not to do anything, then he should have directed limited action." That's Leon Panetta. Robert Gates also voiced criticism. I've got former UN ambassador and American Enterprise Institute senior fellow John Bolton in Washington to talk about this. Ambassador, is it unusual to have critiques like this, strong words, from both sides of the aisle?
Well, I was struck by the criticism by both former secretaries of defense, and I think it reflects the perception across the board, really, except for the people who automatically read White House talking points, that this so-called deal between the United States and Russia is a debacle for the United States. I mean, I personally have not favored the use of force either because of the red line or to aid the Syrian opposition. But the fact is, what the president has done here has undercut his own stated objective of removing Assad from power or of making that regime pay for the use of chemical weapons. And I think it's perceived very widely in the Middle East, from which I've just returned after a week in the Persian Gulf area, and I'm afraid it's perceived around the world as weak, indecisive flip-flopping by the United States. It's going to cost us not just in Syria, but I think worldwide.
On your trip through the Middle East, Ambassador, what specifically are your sources telling you about the likely outcome here? I mean, are we looking at kind of plodding along, talking about the chemical weapons convention, and then just sort of seeing how it goes? I mean, where do they see the end game?
Well, I don't think anybody seriously believes this means the end of the Assad regime's chemical weapons capabilities. Let's be clear, the Russians have been violating the Chemical Weapons Convention since it came into force in the mid-1990s, and that government is going to guarantee performance by Bashar al-Assad. It's not going to happen. I think the Russians kept their eye on their strategic interest, which was to buy time for Assad, to permit the struggle against the opposition to continue. And I think the United States didn't know throughout the course of the past 10 days what its strategic interest is. So there's no red line on chemical weapons, there's no American strike, there's no significant aid for the Syrian opposition. I have to believe this is terribly demoralizing from the perspective of the opposition that actually was friendly to the United States. I'm sure the terrorists and the radical Islamicists in the opposition are delighted by what they see.
Is there an argument to be made that Syria is in somewhat of a sideshow here, that actually the real problem is what this is going to mean for Iran and Iran's nuclear program?
Absolutely. I think that's been the central point all along. I think for all that Syria is a tragedy, there's no doubt about that, it is a strategic sideshow. The support for terrorism by the regime in Tehran, its nuclear weapons program, very, very close to success after 20 years of effort. This is where the administration should have focused its attention, but I'll make a prediction for you. I think if you thought the Syrian chemical weapons deal was bad, get ready for the deal the administration wants to strike with Iran over the much more dangerous, much more threatening nuclear weapons program. You've got the president and Iranian President Hassan Rouhani both speaking to the UN General Assembly next Tuesday. The Secretary General always has a lunch that day to welcome the heads of state. I think you're going to see that famous handshake at that lunch. It's very easy to make that quote-unquote happen. So I think the administration is determined to show they can negotiate with Iran. I think they want a deal. I think they'll get a deal, and I think it'll be a terrible deal.
A terrible deal. The president would likely play that up as President Obama, the peacemaker, the great achievement of his administration. Ambassador, I hope you'll join us again on this show if and when that happens. Thank you so much for being on the program.
Thank you, Mary.